I am a professor of political science at Oakland University, and I am also the director of our Center for Civic Engagement. Welcome to another Office Hours session. If you are new to Office Hours, this is a session that we do 2-3 times a semester at Oakland University, and what we try to do is highlight faculty experts in a number of different areas. We take on important and timely topics like the one tonight, war in Ukraine 1 year later. And when we take on these topics and have these discussions, it serves to meet the mission of the Center for Civic Engagement, which is to make Oakland University known as a convener of conversations. If this is not your first time in Office Hours, welcome back. We're glad to have you. It's great to have repeat customers. I am delighted to have a panel full of experts from the political science department with us tonight, my poli-sci colleagues, Pete Trumbore, Christian Cantier, and Paul Kubicek. And I'm not going to give you lengthy introductions. You can go to the poli-sci website at oakland.edu/poli-sci and check out all of their accolades. I'm also really excited to welcome Chao-Ning Su as our guest moderator. Chao-Ning Su is also a professor in the Communications and Journalism Department at OU. But the reason for her moderating tonight's session is she's also the director of the Barry M. Klein Center for Globalization and Culture at Oakland University. And this is the first of what I hope are a number of collaborations between the Klein Center and the Center for Civic Engagement. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator tonight, Chao-Ning Su. Chao-Ning, thanks for being here. And thanks to my colleagues again, Pete, Paul, and Christian.
Thank you so much, Dave. Thank you so much for this opportunity. The Klein Center for Culture and Globalization really appreciate this opportunity to collaborate with CCE. As Dave mentioned earlier, this center is a newly established platform here at OU to encourage meaningful conversation on international affairs to foster global perspectives. So you can imagine that I'm super excited to moderate tonight's stellar panel with 3 political science experts. We have Dr. Peter Trumbore, specializing in international conflict management. We have Dr. Paul Kubicek, specializing in post-Soviet Ukraine. And we have Dr. Christian Cantier, specializing in foreign policy analysis. With our 3 experts here tonight, I'm sure that we can all learn from their insights and we will all walk away with a better understanding of the Ukrainian situation. So without further ado, let's start tonight's panel. My first question really is about the timing itself. I remember that a year ago, CCE did a panel very similar to this one right after the conflict started to discuss its development and the projection, the prediction, and everything. I attended that panel as well, and I found it super inspiring. My first question to all of you is that, did any one of you anticipate that a year after we would still be talking about this conflict? And what surprises you the most? I guess we can start with Pete on this question.
Thanks, Chao-Ning. I think the first 2 weeks of the conflict back in 2022 was really telling. The heroic and successful defense of the capital, Kyiv, I think really set the stage for what we've seen. I will admit that I think, like a lot of analysts and a lot of observers at the time, I did not have a lot of faith in the Ukrainians' ability to withstand that initial onslaught. But once they did, that opened the floodgates to American and NATO military material aid. And that has really proven to be the difference. And so, here we are almost a full year later, and we are looking at a conflict that has become in many ways a very old-fashioned battle of attrition in which the primary implements of war are artillery and infantry. And this is the kind of conflict we haven't seen really in 70, almost 80 years. And I think that it's going to be interesting to think about where it goes and how it potentially might move forward from this point. But yeah, I did, when we did this 11 months ago, I didn't think we would still be talking about it, when we got to this point in 2023.
Yeah. Paul, Christian, any thoughts on this?
I would just say that I don't know if anybody got much of this right, to be honest. I think most people have been very surprised by the resilience of the Ukrainians, not only initially, but they've taken over half of the territory back the Russians initially seized in the early parts of the war. The Western aid has certainly made a big difference. And you can today, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, we can actually have a conversation and at least entertain the idea seriously of Ukraine prevailing in this conflict, which would have been rather inconceivable a year ago. At the same time, I think another thing that people may have gotten wrong is they thought, well, after the Russian setbacks or maybe the implementation of sanctions, that the Russian will to pursue this conflict might have abated to some degree, or that Putin might have found some sort of opposition to the conflict, that he might have taken a different course or found the war to be counterproductive or retreated a bit. And certainly he hasn't done that. And Russia seems as gung-ho in this conflict, I would say, as they did a year ago. And I don't see any prospect of it abating. And I would imagine, I would place a bet, and we can do all this, that a year from now, if you wish, we'll have another session like this, because I don't see the war ending anytime soon.
Right. Christian?
Yeah, going beyond Ukraine, I would say that many of us, including myself, were surprised by the strength of Western solidarity. There are a few exceptions here, of course. Germany can be criticized for slow walking some of the aid. Hungary, of course, stands out as well. But generally speaking, Western countries in particular have been working together very well, and I think that's also surprised the Russian administration. I would not have expected for NATO to expand during this period, but we, of course, have seen that with Finland and Sweden. I would also not have expected for Ukraine and Moldova and probably Georgia soon to become official European Union candidates, which is, if you look at Central and Eastern European politics, a rather revolutionary change in the extent and the degree to which the European Union thinks these countries can become members.
Yeah, no, I would agree. When it is extremely difficult to watch the atrocity of this conflict, it is also extremely inspiring to see the strengths, the resilience of the Ukrainian population, that's for sure. I would like to remind the audience that you can use the Q&A section to have your questions posted there. We will go through the questions with the panelists first, and then we will save some time at the end of the panel to answer your questions. So if you can leave your question there, we will be sure to get to you. Okay, so the next question really is about the current status of the conflict. A year into the war, what should those of us who aren't experts understand the current status of the conflict, and what do we know about Putin and Zelensky are approaching a war at this point?
I think where we're sort of poised on the brink of spring offensive and counteroffensives. And I think that what we've seen over the last several months of winter has been a consolidation of the front lines in Eastern Ukraine and preparations for a resumption of significant offensive operations on both sides. The performance of the Russian military has been shockingly poor. It has also been shockingly brutal. And in some ways that is in keeping with historical norms for the Russian military. Certainly this is not out of, if you look at the historical record of the way that the Russian military has behaved, certainly since the Soviet era began, this sort of callous disregard, not just for the lives of civilians, but for the lives of their own soldiers, is perfectly in line with the general patterns. That said, I think that they're fighting for two different outcomes. I think that at one level, I'm beginning to believe that Russia could be satisfied with consolidating control over and annexing Eastern Ukraine. And I think that Ukraine now is in a position, and Zelensky believes, that they have the possibility not just of liberating the rest of Eastern Ukraine, but also taking Crimea back, which Russia annexed in 2014. And so I think that that given that we are in a position where both sides believe they can still meet their objectives on the battlefield, we're a long way from any serious conversation about a negotiated settlement.
Do we happen to know how many casualties have been there in this war? This is a question from the audience.
The estimates are, I mean, both sides, I mean, these are complete estimates and they don't necessarily break down the dead versus the wounded, but you're seeing figures of 200,000 on the Russian side, which you can debate how many of those are dead versus how many of those are injured. The Ukrainian side, they also have not been very forthcoming in those estimates. I've seen estimates of about 100,000 there. And again, we don't know how many would be dead as opposed to wounded. And then the civilian casualties now are in the, I believe we're approaching about 10,000, if I'm not mistaken. I think that's roughly what the numbers are.
I would add to that the millions of refugees, of course, and cases of kidnappings of Ukrainian children, them being taken to Russia. So the war's casualties, I think, have been much more extensive, right? And this stuff will have a long-term effect, I think, in particular on Ukraine's population for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, and if I remember correctly, I think something like 1 in 4 Ukrainians has been displaced as a consequence of the war. So like 25% of the population has been displaced as a consequence.
So this is a brutal war, that's for sure. But at the same time, we've been seeing a lot of impact of Western military aid and weapons transfers to Ukraine. Question for the three of you. Do you think this kind of like Western military aid giving Ukraine a strategic advance to move forward, or do you see some negative consequences from such help? And do you think the US and its allies should do more or should do less in situation like this?
If I could start with that, I would say that there's no question that the Western aid has allowed the Ukrainians to be able to both defend their positions and make the advancements that they made in the summer and the fall. And now they have an increased ability to strike behind the front lines against Russian forces and not neutralize, but certainly impose greater casualties upon the Russian forces. And they're getting more equipment, right? They're getting Abrams tanks, they're getting Leopard tanks, they're getting a lot of sophisticated artillery. These things weren't really on the table a year ago. So you've seen a gradual sort of ramping up in Western military support, but it's always been, there's always seems to be sort of a ceiling to that you can get this, but not this, but it seems to be going up. The latest conversation, of course, is whether they're going to get American aircraft, especially F-16 fighters, which could be a really big game changer, but it'll take a long period of time to train Ukrainian pilots to fly those aircraft. And it's also going to take time to get those tanks to the battlefield, and whether they'll be sufficient to really enable Ukraine to launch a major offensive is questionable. And here I think we get to the question of a larger question of what American aid is designed to do. Is it designed to prevent a Russian victory, or is it designed to help Ukraine win? And those are two different things. How far you want to go. Do you want to just say Russia must not win, or do you want to say Russia must lose? I'm going to be totally honest here. I'm on one side of that unequivocally. And so the answer to your last part of the question is, I think we should be providing them with significant, as much as we have already, a lot of military aid, even more, because this year is going to be decisive and they need to make a turn. They need to press forward while they can. The window is not going to be unlimited here. And so I would like to see more Western military assistance.
If I could chime in on a different aspect of this, a lot of this has required very careful consultation and coordination between the United States and its allies, and I think a great example of that is seen with the Patriot air defense system. So the United States ultimately agreed to provide a Patriot missile battery to Ukraine, and And the importance of that, right? This is an air defense system. One of the things that has been particularly challenging for the Ukrainians is civilian targets are being hit by missile and drone attack, and it's something the Ukrainians have a difficult time defending against. But the United States, our position was, for this to have maximum impact, it needs to be transferred from someplace already in Europe, and the partner of choice was the Netherlands. So the United States was going to supply the battery, but the Netherlands was going to supply the munitions. And it took significant diplomatic effort to get the Dutch on board. And there was a lot of back and forth in December and January over the holiday season to sort of get the Netherlands to basically play ball. And these systems have since been delivered, but it took a lot of diplomatic energy. I would say similar dynamics with Germany and Germany's reluctance that we mentioned before to supply the Leopard 2 main battle tank, or to allow other countries that have Leopard 2s to provide them. That took a lot of coordination, and the Germans were not eager to go down that road. So I think that Paul is right. That Western military assistance, Western material military aid has been critical for allowing Ukraine to achieve what they've achieved so far, and will be critical for them moving forward. But we need to keep in mind that this has not been an automatic kind of process where we turn a spigot and weapons and ammunition and weapon systems flow easily. In each country where this has been, in each country that is providing aid, it is an intensely political process.
Yeah. So to continue this kind of military aid, meaning that you have to secure long-term attention from the policymakers, right? So the question is, do you think that Ukraine will be able to secure long-term attention from policymakers, especially from the US, or do you think this kind of attention to the war will fade eventually? Christian, what do you think about this question?
Just to add, I do agree with Paul. I think one of the things that we've learned about Western assistance is that it isn't really dependent on Russia's actions, and Russia's reactions aren't really in accordance with the extent of aid that the West provides to Ukraine. I mean, Russia started with atrocities, so it's not like they're going to just escalate Western aid, and Kremlin propaganda, of course, is already saying that Russia is at war with NATO, is at war with the United States, and that's why Ukraine is winning. To your question, I think in the short term, Kyiv will be able to secure quite a bit of attention from U.S. decision makers and from other leaders. I think there's consistent support. Some of it even crosses ideological lines. It's been one of the relatively few issues in American politics that's been pretty bipartisan, with some exceptions on the fringes. So I think in the short term, that attention will be kept up in Washington. What I worry about is, and this speaks once again to the importance of speed and speedy assistance to Ukraine. What I worry about is an increasingly polarized environment, not only in the United States, but across the world, in which assistance to Kyiv gets politicized. And I'm seeing some rumblings of this, both inside the United States, where of course the presidential campaign might lead to the politicized nature of Western aid, but I'm seeing this emerge in other countries, including Germany, where people are testing messaging that involves reducing aid to Ukraine. So I think in this context, speed is of the utmost importance, and it will help Kyiv, because that attention will, I think, erode going into 2024, especially.
I think one of the real big surprises has been just how effective Volodymyr Zelensky has been as a diplomat and an advocate, and how tirelessly he has been sort of working the diplomatic levers across Europe, to garner and maintain support for the Ukrainian struggle. He was just in the UK. He has both visited foreign capitals and has welcomed foreign dignitaries. And I think if you sort of think back to, Volodymyr Zelensky as a candidate and a newly elected president, I don't think a lot of people had a lot of confidence. He was an entertainer. He was a comedian, an actor, and with the only political background and experience he had was in playing a Ukrainian president in a situation comedy on Ukrainian television, right? He has turned out to be a remarkably effective advocate for his country's cause. And I think a lot of the international support that has continued to flow Ukraine's way is in large measure a testament to his effectiveness as a diplomat and as an advocate.
If I could just add one thing, what Christian said, I think it's important to think about, though, that time really matters. So Western attention spans are going to be relatively short. The Ukrainians care about this war the most. The Russians deeply care about this war, and the West doesn't care as much. And given the presidential campaign in the United States, which may or may not, this issue may not figure prominently. Certainly, the amount of aid has been significant, right? And that's a potential issue that could be raised. Ukraine really needs to make good use of the aid and make gains on the battlefield this year. If Ukraine is unable to press the advantage like they've done, it's going to cause more people in Europe and in the United States to say, well, we tried. They're not going to be able to make a breakthrough. They're not going to be able to defeat Russia. And then we get to discussion, which I'm sure we can talk about a potential, a deal that might end the fighting as opposed to trying to end the fighting on the battleground. But I think right now, there's a lot of expectation that this year will be decisive in it. And the West is given, as I said, significant amount of weapons, but whether or not they're truly game changers or not, I'm not certain about that.
And just to bring it back to sort of the politics of Ukraine aid in the United States, there is a core of hardline conservatives in Congress, and now that the Republican Party controls the House of Representatives, who are skeptical of and have been opposing increasing or even continuing military aid to Ukraine. Given how narrow Republican control of the House is, this could very significantly complicate the Biden administration's efforts to continue to provide the level of military support that we have been over the last year. So the political dynamics have changed a little bit on the U.S. side. It is, generally speaking, a bipartisan issue in the U.S. and in the U.S. Congress, except there is that core, that small but vital core of hardline conservatives in the House who could complicate things in ways that that we need to be sort of thinking about moving forward.
Yeah, I think this is very similar to what Christian mentioned earlier, the ideological issues, right, in the policymaking. The audience would like to know if you can unpack the ideologies you were referring to earlier. Like, what were you saying?
Yeah, so I think this kind of brings up what Pete is mentioning here. I think within primarily the Republican Party, but I don't think that's really exclusively the Republican Party. I think there is skepticism about the extent of aid that Ukraine should be receiving. A lot of the ideological debates, I think, in 2023 and 2024 will also depend on the positions that leading candidates like Donald Trump will take. I think what we've seen, at least in the last few years, is that policy positions or ideological positions are somewhat flexible and dependent on what people like Donald Trump decide to support. So I think if the issue comes up and if a few Republican candidates, including Donald Trump, raise some degree of skepticism or questions about Ukrainian aid, in light of that kind of soft support that exists on some of the fringes, I think we're likely going to see it become a lot more politicized.
Yeah.
And just to kind of add to that, it's important to also understand that Russian propaganda is continuing during the war, and they're testing out a variety of narratives, both in the United States, Western Europe, the global South, and other places. And eventually something is going to stick as long as it fits kind of domestic or local conditions. So I think that's why speed is very important. Thus far, we've had some degree of bipartisan agreement, but I think that's going to be eroded as more debates come up and as people vocalize more opposition to Ukrainian aid.
So I guess the sense is that this war is not going to end anytime soon, and it is very likely going to become a political issue. So if the war continues as a stalemate heading into summer, many say this could potentially benefit Russia. If that's the case, do you think that we are going to see some talks for a peace deal? And is that something that worth exploring? Maybe we can start with Paul on this question.
Well, I do think the longer the war goes on, Russia's a bigger country. It's going to be able to press an advantage against the Ukrainians. So the longer the war goes on, I think it benefits the Russian case, which is why I think the Russian side, which I think why this year is absolutely essential for the Ukrainians to continue to make some gains and progress and press the advantage where they can. How far the battle lines go, we don't know yet. But thinking about what a peace settlement might look like, it's going to be very difficult, particularly as long as both sides think they can win. It's not going to be a ripe conflict for settlement in the sort of jargon of international relations literature. But I would say this, that both sides have kind of painted themselves into a corner in this, and this is where it's going to be very difficult. Public opinion polls indicate that there's no mood at all for compromise on the Ukrainian side, including Crimea, meaning Ukrainians believe they can win it all back. Zelensky cannot really make a deal without betraying Ukraine and the rhetoric that he's already sort of espoused, that they'll take back every single square centimeter of territory. So it's hard for the Ukrainians to make any sort of compromise at all. From the Russian point of view, it's not emphasized that much, but remember in September of last year, Russia formally annexed 4 regions of Ukraine, and Putin claimed that this would be Russian territory now and forever. Russia does not control all of that territory. It does not control all of Kherson Oblast. It does not control all of Zaporizhia Oblast. It doesn't even control all of Donetsk Oblast, where we've seen the most intense fighting over the last month. For Russia to cede any of that territory, which, by the way, would include the capital city of Kherson and the capital city of Zaporizhia, which they don't control, would be very difficult given the fact that under Russian law, that they consider that sovereign Russian territory. They painted themselves into a corner in this particular situation. Maybe, Putin thought it was a gambit that would pay off, but it's going to make it really, really tough for there to be any sort of peace deal where Russia would give up any of that territory. And again, they don't control all of it right now.
If I could piggyback on a point that Paul brought up, international relations jargon, and which I love, because I've been talking with my students. I'm teaching a class this term on international negotiation, and last semester I taught my course on international conflict. And in both of those classes, we talk about this idea of what makes a conflict so-called ripe for resolution, and one of the ideas is the recognition that the combatants are locked in what's called a mutually hurting stalemate, where they recognize that if they continue to fight, they will not be able to achieve their objectives, and they will only continue to harm themselves. If you can get to that point, then you can open their eyes to the potential for negotiated settlement. But as long as either side believes that they can achieve their principal goals militarily, they will be loath to go to the negotiating table. And I think that that's the situation we're in. At one level, in human terms, you could argue, and again, this is just in human sort of, in terms of human life, you could argue that Western military assistance, by giving Ukraine the ability to continue to resist, and by giving Ukraine the ability to believe that they could potentially even win, is prolonging the conflict in ways that is morally and ethically questionable. If we think about the number of lives that have already been lost over the last almost 12 months and are likely to continue to be lost would it have been better in human terms, in terms of human life, for Ukraine simply to have been defeated in the first month of the war? That it's a difficult thing to think about, right? But one of the consequences of Western military aid has been to create the perception on the part of the Ukrainians that they can prevail on the battlefield. And as long as they continue to believe that, they have little incentive to go to the bargaining table. You know, the terms of agreement that Zelensky's put on the table are maximalist. You know, every inch of Ukrainian territory back. And Russia's response has not been much more conciliatory. And, you know, as long as each side believes that they have the potential still remains for them to militarily defeat their opponent, you're not going to see serious peace negotiations.
Just to add to that, I think the Ukrainians are very well aware of the fact that they're going to be subject to more and more pressure, including from allies, to reach some sort of what I suppose the allies would call compromise. Now, of course, they don't perceive it in that way, right? Because their territory has been occupied by an invading force. So compromise or peace negotiations without that sort of maximalist goal would not be peace negotiations at all. That being said, I do think that Zelensky and people around him, they are aware of the fact that perhaps even the United States, although I think they're going to start getting more pressure from countries like Germany and perhaps even France to start negotiations if the war stalls. And once again, this goes back to what we were saying, that 2023 is going to be essential, really, in the extent to which Ukraine can secure territorial control or can weaken Russia to the point where they can get to an outcome that makes them happy.
And look, I want to be clear that the point that I raised is very easy for me to articulate, because I'm not the one, and it's not my family, it's not my country that is being subjugated to this. You know, I think this is a danger for academics, that we can, you know, we stand outside and we try to look dispassionately and try to bring our analytical frameworks to bear to try to understand, and to try to think about what could potentially change dynamics on the ground. But at the end of the day, we don't have any skin in the game, right? And so I recognize how what I just said could sound really callous, and certainly wouldn't be an outcome that I would accept if I were Ukrainian. But I also think it's a point that needs to be raised and needs to be thought about.
But if I may, I mean, it raises a larger question I would ask, just partially rhetorically, but something maybe we would pursue, like a Russian victory. What is the impact of that? You know, geopolitically, on the United States, on Europe, everywhere. What is that? I mean, I understand the human cost of it. I absolutely understand what you're saying, and I don't want to misconstrue it in any way, but you have to weigh that obviously against what if Russia were to prevail, what were the consequences of it is. And that's where I think we have skin in the game on some level. But I think people disagree and perceive it differently, and how you consider the cost of a Russian victory. If you consider it to be very catastrophic, you're much more likely to be all in on supporting Ukraine. If you can accept some sort of Russia gains, or, you know, like a mixed outcome here in some ways. But obviously, as Christian noted, the Ukrainians wouldn't perceive it that way. You might be willing, you would push more, I think, for some sort of quote negotiated settlement.
Yeah, look, I would agree with you, Paul. The strategic and geopolitical consequences of a successful war of aggression in Europe after 80 years, I think none of us want to spend too much time thinking about, because those consequences are potentially disastrous. And so what does that mean? That means that we sacrifice Ukrainian lives on the altar of preventing larger war. And I think that's part of the moral and ethical calculus that we need to think about too.
But as long as the Ukrainians are willing to do that, I mean, that's the difference here, right? We're not doing the fighting. They want the fighting. They're asking for our assistance. And I think that has allowed Zelensky and the Ukrainians as a whole to be very effective advocates for their cause, because they're just asking for arms. They're not asking for American blood, which would be very different, right? And so I think that's allowed us to provide a level of support that we would not do if they were asking for the United States to send in military forces to support them. We wouldn't, I don't think we would do that.
I think both Paul and Pete raised very good question about the geopolitical consequences of this war. The whole world is watching, and they are all taking notes, figure out the lessons from the war. So let's think about, countries in Asia, for example, China. What are they learning from this war? What are the lessons for them? What are they taking away from Russia's experience fighting Ukraine and the international response to it? I mean, at the beginning of the war, I think a lot of people, political analysts, were feared that this might embolden China to try to reclaim Taiwan by force. Is this still the case? Is China learning, taking a different message from the war a year by now, or what are you seeing?
I would say just briefly that there's sort of two things, I guess I would say. The successful defense of Ukraine, I think, should give China pause, because frankly, there's a big difference between driving armored columns across a land border and doing a maritime invasion of an island like Taiwan. So militarily, they're very different exercises. I think that in general, had Russia achieved early success, that would have been a really, really dangerous message for the Chinese government to have received. That would have been a dangerous lesson. Given how difficult the war has been for Russia, I think it should encourage caution on the part of the Chinese. Their practical military experience is frankly really limited. China has not gone to war since the 1980s. They are not in any way battle tested. You could argue that Russia should have been better prepared and better equipped to manage, given that they have more recent sort of experience on fighting on the ground in a number of theaters, whether we're talking about Georgia or talking about Russian intervention in Syria or whatever. China hasn't had any meaningful military experience since the 1980s, and I think that also should raise. I would think that would raise caution in their minds.
Yeah, and I would add as well, I mean, you've seen President Biden give very strong support for Taiwan. You've seen discussions about increased military aid to Taiwan. I think this has been a real wake-up call in certain ways for the West. And the West has proven to be, at least for the moment, rather united against Russian aggression here. And I think the Chinese, at this point, yeah, if they ever had ambitions to attack Taiwan, they really need to, I think, second, third thoughts after what has occurred here. And I agree with Pete. If it would have turned out an easy victory for the Russians, that would have given them great encouragement. Right now, I would think that their lesson would be that they should be cautious rather than be aggressive. And that aggression is unlikely to really pay dividends for them.
I would add that it's also, I think, taught a lot of countries that have thought about constructing what Putin has defined as a multipolar world. So some of the emerging states, but China in particular, but not only China. We're talking here about India, about a number of other countries. I think they are learning to be more cautious, and I think they're learning to be more conciliatory in light of Western solidarity, which I think might extend to solidarity in other areas. Some of these countries, China, for example, are realizing that they continue to depend quite a bit on the West, and for instance, in terms of technological innovation, right? So the country wants to be a tech powerhouse, but it needs assistance from, or willingness from, the United States in that regard. And I think the irony of kind of the attack backfiring and consolidating Western solidarity, I think, is going to lead to some degree of more conciliatory relations and between the West and other countries.
Well, I have to say, as someone from Taiwan, I'm very pleased to hear your comments on this answer. Our audience do want to learn a little bit more about Putin, his role, his leadership in this war. The first question is that, how much of a factor do you think Putin's rumored health issue have played in his ability to lead Russia in this war? And then a follow-up question, do you think there's any chance that Putin would be replaced? Third question, given his leadership dynamics, do you think that nuclear option could be a possibility?
I'm gonna turn this over to those who are far more expert on the mind of Vladimir Putin than I am.
Yeah, I don't claim any unique insight into his mind or his health. I think that it's safe to say that he believed that he could prevail. He miscalculated that would prevail easily. I think that he certainly wants to reanimate some fashion of the Russian Empire. I think that that's a part of his driving ambitions, whether that's health related or his own mortality related. I can't particularly say. He has consolidated his power very well, very ably, and I don't see, and he's made it for years now, even prior to the war, he's made it impossible for Russians really to imagine an alternative to Putin, what that would be. And I think that's part of his, that's an asset for him, right? That he's indispensable in certain ways. I certainly don't see a legal means for him to be thrown out of power, meaning an election. I don't see any rumblings within the military itself to stage a coup against Putin. Some thought there might be, but that doesn't seem to be very likely. There's discussions about the shadowy Wagner group and this, but again, he seems to be quite sort of secure in his position. The war, he's managed, he's taken control of the war. He's managed to deflect criticism from him and put it on the shoulders of others. So thus far, he seems, I think, quite secure in his position. And as for the last part about nuclear escalation, I would say this about this. Putin has sort of trotted this out repeatedly, but you're hearing a lot less of this than you did several months ago. And the United States has consistently pushed forward with its weapons assistance to Kiev. The Ukrainians have made significant gains against Russian territory at great cost to the Russians. And the Russian escalation has been, it's been substantial in the sense that they've been attacking Ukrainian cities, but you're not seeing that sort of rhetoric, and you're certainly not seeing any evidence of deployment of weapons of mass destructions at all. I hesitate to say it's a complete bluff, but it doesn't seem a high likelihood of that in the immediate prospects for that. Others may disagree.
I agree with Paul. I think focusing on rumors of health issues or whatever is not productive. I think the easiest explanation is that Putin is a dictator. He has consolidated power in Russia. He has certain views on Ukraine and Ukrainians. He doesn't think the country should exist, nor that the Ukrainian nation is a thing that should exist. And he has in the past conducted himself in a way that carried relatively few consequences. And here I think some Western countries coddling him and his cronies, I think, has played a significant role. We're talking here about the United Kingdom, we're talking here about Germany, Gazprom, and all of its networks around. So I think that's probably a better focus rather than these rumors of Putin having any sort of health issue. On the nuclear threats, that seems to me, I agree with Paul. In fact, I would go even further and say that it's a relatively effective piece of Kremlin propaganda. I don't think a nuclear attack is likely. I think it plays to a lot of Western anxieties that I think go back to the Cold War. Some of this might be generational as well. So I, especially as a Central and Eastern European scholar and as somebody from Eastern Europe, the fears about a nuclear attack seem really overblown to me. Putin continues to be, however brutal, a rational actor, and that's a pretty certain method for him to disappear and to lose power. So it's I think it's an effective element of Kremlin propaganda, and it's it plays to a lot of Western anxieties that are I think are largely misplaced.
Let me add a caveat to that. I don't disagree with what you said. I do think that the risks of escalation to nuclear weapons does place a concrete ceiling on the extent of Western military aid that will be provided. The United States and NATO have resisted all along calls for the imposition of no-fly zones over Ukraine, because to enforce a no-fly zone means that you are putting American and NATO military personnel into the skies over Ukraine to potentially shoot down Russian planes. And it's that kind of direct confrontation that I think everyone wants to avoid, because the potential is always there, no matter how remote, for any direct military confrontation between the United States and the Russians, or NATO and the Russians, for that to work its way up a spiral of escalation that could culminate in the use of nuclear weapons is a real issue. So I don't believe that that Putin would authorize the use of nuclear weapons absent some kind of spiral of escalation that gets us to that point. I see it. I would agree that at this stage, right, it's posturing and propaganda, but the risk of escalation, I think we should not ignore.
So that's about Russia, but our audience would really like to know about Ukraine as well. Their question about what is the state of the Ukrainian economy right now? How has the war impacted that aspect of the nation? And what does Ukrainian reconstruction might look like? Do you think it is possible for Ukraine to survive and prosper as a democratic state again?
Well, according to the World Bank, the Ukrainian economy is going to shrink by about 1/3 this year. So there have been devastating economic consequences. A lot of Ukrainians' heavy industry is in the east. This has been either destroyed or occupied by the Russians. The supply lines, infrastructure, all of its energy infrastructure in particular. I mean, the consequences have been quite severe. Although, again, the Ukrainians have managed to make do. They rebuild. They have proven to be resilient. You don't see opposition. You don't see them suing for peace or anything like this. Reconstruction, if it comes or when it comes, is going to be extraordinarily costly. In some ways, of course, they'll be able to get rid of some of the old Soviet infrastructure and replace it with something new. I imagine actually part of the deal will be that the European Union is going to shoulder much of the burden for that. They would admit Ukraine fast-track membership or some sort of agreement and supply a lot of the economic assistance that would be necessary for that. Probably the United States would as well, but I expect Europe would do more of that. But that will be could be a generational task, given the devastation, at least in parts of Ukraine.
On the question of Ukraine surviving as a democracy, I'm fairly optimistic about that prospect. I think one of the consequences of the Russian invasion of Ukraine is that it's taught Ukrainians that they are they're paying with blood for their own independence, for their own democratic system, and I think that sort of lesson is not going to disappear very quickly. I think there's a realization that those principles are very important, particularly when the rival is a non-democracy, a dictatorship. So I think that's going to be a core element of Ukrainian identity for the foreseeable future. I think a reevaluation of what it means to be Ukrainian is going to be in the works, and I think being part of the West, being democratic, is going to be an essential part of that.
I just want to add on to that. I think one of the things that this war has produced has been in some ways, a consolidation of Ukrainian identity and Ukrainian nationalism, that there were elements in Ukrainian society who, prior to the invasion, did not identify as primarily Ukrainian in terms of their nationality, their national identity. And I think that, pre-war, this is one of the things that Putin looked at and said, okay, there's this population in Ukraine that identifies as Russian, and therefore we will be welcomed as liberators, heroes, and so on and so forth. And the reality is that the consequence of invasion has been to crystallize and concretize in many ways Ukrainian identity, such that it also includes Russian speakers, folks who would have earlier identified principally as ethnic Russian. And so from a nationalist perspective, the war has done what you typically see, and that is, in times of conflict, people rally around the identity that's being challenged, the identity that's under threat. And so this is one of these episodes that helps us, feel confident in some of the things we believe theoretically about the way national identity and nationalism works.
Let me just emphasize for the audience, this is a civic type of nationalism, even sort of a liberal type of nationalism, right? It's not ethnic. It's not even rooted in language. So it may be a little awkward, but you can speak Russian in Ukraine today and consider yourself to be a patriotic Ukrainian. In fact, Zelensky's a native Russian speaker, right? And many times if you're on TV, you see Ukrainian soldiers go into these villages and liberate them. And the people in the village and the soldiers are speaking Russian. They're speaking Russian. They're not speaking Ukrainian. And so this is not, and I just want to emphasize that, it's not an ethnic exclusive based nationalism. It's more open, it's more liberal, it's civic oriented around ideas of civic patriotism and as Christian suggested, democratic values as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Western leaning, all of that.
Yeah.
If I may just,
I'm sorry. Go ahead. No.
I'll just add a very quick note here, which I think has been a really huge concern to Eastern European and Central European identity, and that has to do with corruption and good governance. I think one of the other things that this war has taught, I think, a lot of Central and Eastern Europeans is that corruption has severe consequences, particularly the kind of underfunding of the Ukrainian military, economic networks, many of them shadowy to Russia, that created dependence. So I think transparency, anti-corruption, good governance are also, I expect, going to be pretty important elements of a future Ukrainian identity.
Thank you. Another question from the audience is about Russia's economy. So Russia's oil revenue has been severely limited due to sanctions. How do you see this impact the future of this conflict?
According to the IMF, the Russian economy is supposed to grow by 0.3% this year, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's better than what Great Britain's going to experience. The Russian economy has not been hit that hard. I mean, granted, they're still selling a lot of oil, maybe at prices lower than what they had before, but they're finding customers in India, China, Turkey, and elsewhere. The sanctions have not proven to be that effective yet. Certainly, it hasn't stopped Putin from making his military decisions. So I would say if there is going to be an economic impact, we haven't seen it yet. We may see it, but it hasn't been that substantial yet. It certainly, I don't think has figured into Russian calculations.
I think where we've seen some impact of sanctions and has been in Russia's ability to quickly rebuild and rearm. They have been hit particularly hard in some of the technology areas that go into the manufacture of precision weapons and things like that. This is in part why they've had to turn, for example, to the Iranians for drones, why they've had to purchase artillery and missile systems from North Korea. It's in part because their ability to manufacture in sufficient quantities and at sufficient speed to continue to arm their own forces has been degraded by the sanctions regime. But Paul is correct. There are plenty of countries that are still willing to do business with Russia, and that's going to mitigate the overall economic damage.
So I think we still have time for one last question. We want to go back to the idea of a possible peace deal. Like, I know you mentioned it's hard to achieve, but if there is a possibility, what does a peace deal might look like? And at what point do you think that Biden administration will begin to leverage NATO and other forces to force the two sides to talk to each other?
I guess I do not see a plausible solution that does not involve territorial concessions by Ukraine. I think for a lot of reasons, ideological, nationalist, historical identity, I find it almost inconceivable to imagine Russia giving Crimea back. And if the Zelensky government's position is going to continue to be that Crimea must also be repatriated to Ukrainian sovereignty, I think that's going to preclude a negotiation. I think any negotiation is going to require a territorial concession, and I think that the West does have the ability to leverage our support for Ukraine to force Ukraine to the table. I wouldn't recommend that. You force Ukraine to the table, that assumes that Russia is going to be willing to give them something that Ukraine could accept, and I'm not certain that Russia is willing to do that. So that's sort of it's a very pessimistic take on my part. I don't see any short-term prospect for successful negotiated settlement.
No, I don't either. I would say, first of all, that I think we need to give the Ukrainians a chance to win back more of their territory and see what they can do, first of all, before we do that. Secondly, I sort of disagree with the premise. I mean, it's up to the Ukrainians to decide what to do. And I would hate to say that we should be dictating any terms to them about them conceding their territory. I would say that I could foresee a peaceful settlement. Another scenario would be if Putin wasn't in power. I think that would change the calculus on the Russian side a bit, but we're not seeing signs of that either. So I wouldn't be optimistic. And the larger question I would say is, how could the Ukrainians possibly trust Putin to abide by any settlement? How is there any viable settlement that would possibly stick? And what could make it stick, short of, which would be impolitic as well, short of territorial concessions, but Ukraine gets into the EU and they're on track for NATO membership, and that Putin wouldn't accept.
There we go.
So see, I just don't see a possibility. I think the battlefield has to change before we begin to get to think about what the peace settlement looks like.
Yeah, I agree with Paul on that. I think the talks about a settlement now would not be particularly useful. I think helping Ukraine gain more power would allow for a better set of negotiations, whatever those might look like in 2023, 2024, or whatever.
I think with that, we have to conclude our panel for tonight. Again, thank you, Paul, Peter, and Christian, for your insightful conversation on this topic. I know peace is hard, but I really do hope it will arrive at some point. I hope that we don't have to do a panel like this next year at this time. So thank you again for being here with us tonight. To our audience as well, this is again a collaboration between CCE Center for Civic Engagement and Climb Center for Culture and Globalization and the Alumni Association as well at OU. We are going to have another event on March 9th, which is going to be a hybrid format to feature OU's President Ora Peskovitz and the history professor Derek Hastings. So we will have flyers sent out, and hopefully you can join us on March. Thank you so much. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.